timely education and programs. In the year to the South Asian archipelagic island country, Maldives is committed to raising the quality of the education system. In recent years, we have witnessed a shift from special needs education to inclusive education in the Maldives. The educational rights of children with disabilities were ensured with the implementation of the Inclusive Education Policy in the year 2013, which was later revised in 2020 to align with the CRPD. In the year 2018, the Special Education Unit of the Ministry of Education was upgraded into the Department of Inclusive Education. To promote the principles of inclusion and equity, Individual Education Plan was remodeled as the Inclusive Education Policy 2020, which defines the target groups as students with complex learning profiles. The Education Sector Plan 2019 to 2023 identified goals to advance education for children with disabilities. To meet these goals, the country has trained teachers on early intervention to expand access to schools for children with disabilities. The country has also witnessed the provision of assistive technologies to regular and special schools in the Maldives. As a result, Maldives has seen an increase in the number of schools with the SEN program. In the year 2014, 52 out of 219 schools offered SEN programs. In the year 2019, 89 schools out of the 213 schools offered SEN programs. The Maldives Education Management Information System (MIMIS) was created in 2017 by the Ministry of Education with the support from UNICEF in an effort to develop a centralized information system that would enable the collection, storage, and retrieval of accurate and timely educational data. The Enhancing Education Development Project, which ran from 2013 to 2018, resulted in improved learning environments in 53 secondary schools. Looking at the achievements in providing learning materials to children with disabilities, a Maldivian Sign Language Dictionary was developed in 2009. In 2015, the Divehi Braille Code was established. With the support from UNICEF, the Ministry of Education and the NGO Care Society have developed an improved school-based EII system to detect disabilities in young children. In 2019, the Monitoring Framework for Inclusive Education was published to be utilized at all levels of the system to track and inform schools' inclusive education activities. The Ministry of Education is working hard to meet the aims of the Education Sector Plan as well as the Sustainable Development Goals of providing a high-quality education to all learners. The Department of Inclusive Education, in collaboration with its partners, is working to discover solutions to the current issues and to ensure that all learners with disabilities get a high-quality education.
The Maldivian Inclusive Education Policy has been updated to comply with the Maldivian Education Act, the National Curriculum Framework, and international treaties. This, I trust, will assist us in achieving our aim of providing the right to education for all learners in the Maldivian education system, whether through traditional schooling or alternative learning pathways.
The South Asian archipelago
Good afternoon. Greetings from UNESCO Bangkok office. Welcome to the regional webinar on making school more inclusive, accessible, and sustainable for learners with disabilities post-COVID-19. My name is Kyunga Christy Bang, Program Officer at UNESCO Bangkok office, and it is my pleasure to be the MC for this webinar. The co-chairs of Disability Inclusive Education in Asia Pacific Working Group is organizing this webinar to celebrate tomorrow's International Day of Persons with Disabilities. The theme for the International Day of Persons with Disability for this year is Leadership and Participation of Persons with Disabilities towards an inclusive, accessible, and sustainable post-COVID-19 world. With this webinar, we will be launching the mapping of disability inclusive education practices in South Asia report, which was commissioned by the UNICEF Regional Office for South Asia, and hearing from key stakeholders from Indonesia, Malaysia, India, and Bhutan on their efforts to promote disability inclusive education. Allow me to go over the housekeeping rule before we start. Next slide. This is the agenda for today's webinar. So there will be two different parts where we will be launching the report, and then the second part will be the panel discussion with the 4 speakers. Next slide. This webinar is being recorded, and please use the Q&A box to ask questions to panel speakers. And if you could change your name, first name, and then followed by last name and the country, that would be great for us to identify for you. And our webinar has a sign language interpretation. All webinar recordings and PowerPoint presentation slides will be available at the webinar page. At the end of the webinar, you will be guided to the exit survey. Please complete the survey for us to improve our future webinar series. And lastly, at the end of the panel session, you will be able to share your upcoming IDPD celebration events at the chat box. Please share the name of the events and the event website at the chat box. We will be collecting the information and then share with the webinar participants. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Mr. Neil Shrestha, UNICEF Disability Youth Advocate from Nepal, for his welcoming remark. Mr. Neil is an inclusive development enthusiast and a youth and disability rights campaigner. He has been engaged in the Blind Youth Association Nepal, Kathmandu Valley chapters as the vice president. He has been working in the disability rights sector in youth leadership since 2016. Mr. Neil, over to you.
Thank you so much, Christy. Warm greetings to all. It's me, Neil Shrestha, a UNICEF Youth Advocate for Disability Inclusion. I'm a visually impaired person. Well, I was born and raised in lower middle class family. Because of my blindness, my family took me far away from my home for my study, where the blind research class along with residential facility was available. After learning basic braille script, I was sent in inclusive class. Since then, I'm studying in inclusive learning environment. As I'm good in study, I always hold first position during my schooling. But because of my blindness, I had to face lots of struggles as well as compromise on many things. No braille were available on time, no equipments or arrangement for learning geometry and pictorial content, no ICT was there, and even the teachers didn't have proper information and knowledge about inclusive teaching learning methodology. Next thing is that since I was far away from my family for a long time, I could not feel the family bonding as well as could not understand about my culture. Though I had to face lots of challenges, one of the achievements I have received through this inclusive environment is socialization as well as interaction. I have seen many friends who were facing struggles for the socialization as well as interaction, as they could not get the inclusive environment for the interaction. Reading of books and teachers' lecture in classroom gives us a huge knowledge platform about the subject matters. But the interaction with among the diverse backgrounds of friends and community members, fieldwork observation on community setting, and involvement in extracurricular activities and clubs provide us really the skills as well as knowledge for which inclusive education is required for the learner with disabilities. Many South Asian countries have already made the provision of running inclusive education. However, in practice, they are still promoting special education in one or another way. Many people still believe that inclusive education is costly, but they have never realized that inclusive education or exclusion is much higher and costlier than the inclusive education. So I'm very happy to be the part of this event. Imagine if I do not have if I taught in special education and no interaction with a student without disability and have no leadership skill, would I be able to lead projects in community level and share such experience in front of you today? Obviously, COVID-19 has created lots of challenges in the implementation of inclusive education. However, the leadership of participation of young people with disabilities is very crucial in the implementation of inclusive education. The government as well as development actors have been trying their best to implement the inclusive education. However, the equal and meaningful participation of persons with disabilities should be included in there. So finally, in this regard, I'm very happy to join in this event. I'd like to warmly welcome you to join in this event to mark the International Day of Disabilities. Mapping on inclusive education provide on inclusive education are very essential for us to understand how other countries have doing their best in the implementation of inclusive education. I request you all to join me and take a step forward towards the disability inclusive education, ensuring all the children with disabilities are included in the education and enjoy their fullest potential. Thank you. I'm very glad to be the part of this event. Thank you. Welcome you all.
Thank you, Mr. Neer, for your sharing your experiences and inspiring messages. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Rosangela Verman Vieire, Global Lead on Disability, UNICEF headquarters, for her opening remark. Over to you, Rosangela.
My name is Rosangela Berman-Bieler, and I'm the Global Lead on Disability at UNICEF HQ in New York. It gives me great pleasure to be opening the event Making Schools More Inclusive, Accessible, and Sustainable for Learners with Disabilities Post-COVID-19. The event is organized by the Asia Pacific Disability Inclusive Education Working Group, co-chaired by UNESCO, Leonard Cheshire, and UNICEF. The purpose of the event is twofold. First, it is to launch the Mapping Disability Inclusive Education Practices in South Asia report, commissioned by UNICEF Regional Office for South Asia. Second, it is to hear from key stakeholders promoting disability inclusive education in their countries and communities in the region. This event marks the International Day of Persons with Disabilities, established by the UN General Assembly in 1992. Celebrated since then, annually on December 3rd, the objective of the day is to increase awareness of the rights of persons with disabilities in all aspects of life, now in line with the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities since its adoption in 2006. The theme chosen for this year's edition is Leadership and Participation of Persons with Disabilities towards an inclusive, accessible, and sustainable post-COVID-19 world. Persons with disabilities are already among the most marginalized and excluded. The COVID-19 pandemic is further aggravating their situation, disproportionately impacting them both directly and indirectly. This is particularly true for children with disabilities, especially in the context of education, with distance and online learning in many cases being offered without accessibility measures. Article 24 of the CRPD recognizes the rights of persons with disabilities to inclusive education with the aim of ensuring the development of personality, talents and creativity, mental and physical abilities to their fullest potential. Besides being a right, inclusive education is also an enabler of other rights, allowing persons with disabilities to flourish and participate effectively in society. The CRPD committee has reiterated the prohibition of exclusion of children with disabilities from the general education system. States must provide reasonable accommodation and support measures to ensure equal access to education. Persons with disabilities must be recognized as partners and not merely recipients of education. States must actively involve organizations of persons with disabilities in all stages of inclusive education policy development. They also should be involved in all awareness-raising activities, as well as in the training of teachers and other school professionals. Education must be made accessible, including learning materials and curricula, infrastructure, recreational spaces, water and sanitation facilities, and transportation. Children with and without disabilities should be able to play, learn, and grow up together. However, children with disabilities are often still being left behind. According to UNICEF Global Report, Seen, Counted, Included, just launched in November this year, there are an estimated 240 million children with disabilities in the world. By the time they reach upper secondary school age, 43% of children with disabilities and nearly all children with the most severe disabilities are out of school. In the Asia-Pacific region, learners with disabilities face barriers such as inaccessible school facilities, lack of assistive technology, and teacher and learning practices that are not inclusive. In some countries, the enrollment rate of learners with disabilities in primary school is less than 1%. In order to contribute to achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 4, UNICEF is working to ensure that children with disabilities have equal access to inclusive education, with all children in the same classroom and school. In 2020, UNICEF supported more than 100 countries, providing disability-inclusive education materials and ensuring that countries have disability-responsive laws and policies on education. Throughout 2020, UNICEF also worked closely with partners to ensure that plans and activities for inclusive education were compatible with measures to curb the COVID-19 pandemic. Now more than ever, it is crucial to work together to ensure that inclusive education becomes a reality for all children with and without disabilities. I would like to commend the Asia Pacific Disability Inclusive Education Working Group for the organization of this event and to thank everyone again for your participation. Please count on us to support your efforts on inclusive education in the region. Thank you again. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Rosangela, for your warm remark highlighting the importance of ensuring inclusion in education, especially for children with disabilities. Now I'd like to invite Ms. Meeta Gupta to moderate the first part of our webinar. Ms. Gupta currently holds the position of Early Childhood Development Specialist and Disability Inclusive Education Focal Point at the UNICEF Regional Office for South Asia. She has worked in the fields of education, early childhood development, and gender and development for over 20 years. Meeta, over to you.
Thank you so much, Christy. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. While countries across the region have committed to ensuring inclusive and equitable education for all as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, children with disabilities continue to be among the most excluded from education and learning, as Rosangela also just talked about. They're more likely to be out of school than their peers without disabilities. And even when they are in school, they often do not receive the support that they need to learn, as Nir also spoke about so eloquently from his own experience. And the situation has likely worsened in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. What is encouraging, however, is that there are many good and promising practices and initiatives that are being implemented in the region to promote the education of children with disabilities. In 2018, we, from UNICEF Regional Office from South Asia, co-organized with a number of other partners a knowledge sharing event at which some of these good and promising practices were showcased. This led to a call for a more systematic mapping of good practices towards a better understanding of policies, strategies, and programs that are working well in promoting disability inclusive education in the context of the South Asia region. This led us to commission a study to map disability inclusive education practices in the region. And we're very pleased to share with you today the report of this mapping study, along with 8 country profiles, one for each of the 8 countries in the region. And these not only outline good and promising practices, but also key gaps and challenges and recommendations for the way forward. And we'll be putting the link to these reports in the chat today for you. We hope that this will inspire further action to promote disability inclusive education in the region, and that you will find these to be useful resources in your work in moving this important agenda forward. I now have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Peter Grimes, who led this mapping study for us and who will be sharing the key findings from it here today. Peter is a highly regarded international academic and education expert with over 34 years of experience in promoting equity in education, inclusive education, early childhood education and intervention, amongst a number of other areas, including extensive experience in these areas right here in the Asia Pacific region. He is adjunct professor in universities in England, Australia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And he's also executive director of the Beyond Education Consultancy, a nonprofit organization based in the Philippines, working on improving basic education for all children. With that, I'd like to welcome Peter to our event today. And Peter, over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Mita, and thanks to all the colleagues who've spent so much time organising this fantastic event. And myself and my colleagues at Beyond Education, we're very, very happy to be here and to be able to present this today. So I'm briefly going to present the findings of the mapping. So the objectives of the mapping were that we wanted to be able to review and document disability inclusive practices, policies and strategies that are effective or promise to be effective in increasing access and or learning outcomes for children with disabilities in education. And also the aim was to inform the development of regional and country level advocacy and programming for disability inclusive education across South Asia. In terms of the scope, the mapping included policies and practices aimed at facilitating the access of children with disabilities to inclusive pre-primary up to higher secondary education, including vocational training and non-formal provision across South Asia from 2010 to 2020. This slide shows you the overview of the theoretical framework that underpin the mapping, and it was derived from the fundamental features of an inclusive education system as it's articulated in general comment number 4 to the UN CRPD. So the framework conceptualizes inclusive education from a rights-based perspective through 4 domains: an enabling environment, demand side, supply, and measurement and monitoring of quality. Analysis of the intersectionality between disability, gender, and humanitarian issues and how this impacts education has also been covered in the mapping, although not in great depth. The methodology included a review of prominent documents, an online survey administered to key education actors in government, non-government organisations and development partners, and extensive review and consultation with UNICEF country offices. Next slide, please. So, this section of the presentation, I'm going to share with you the key findings. Next slide, please. So in the policy and legislative framework, we found that in South Asia, there is a growing commitment to ensuring that children with disabilities are afforded their right to high quality education on an equal basis with others. We found that almost all, 7 out of 8 of countries have signed and or ratified the CRPD. Although Bhutan is yet to ratify the convention, significant policy reforms have been put in place in recent years to address disability inclusion, for example, standards for inclusive education. Disability and general education laws and policies across the region do guarantee inclusion for children with disabilities in education. However, practice predominantly focuses on special education and integration. More than half of the countries endorse a combination of special education and integration. Where inclusion is referenced, these are often a vague statement and not appropriately supported by concrete strategies. More recent general education laws, such as that of Bhutan and India, have included more explicit reference to inclusive education, following the language of the CRPD and the SDG 4. Inclusive educations are more ambitious in setting goals for inclusion. Apart from blanket statements granting the right to education to all, some governments have adopted a dedicated policy on inclusive education, such as in Afghanistan and Maldives. This does create a stronger policy direction for governments and relevant stakeholders. Sri Lanka has a draft policy which the government could build on in furthering the IE agenda. Next slide, please. Education sector planning and financing. We found that children with disabilities are addressed in all education sector plans, except for India, because it does not have an education sector plan in place at this time. A major observation, consistent with the findings in the review of laws and policies, is the apparent focus on strengthening special education, whilst also promoting mainstreaming of children with disabilities in regular classes and enhancing the capacity of schools and teachers to accommodate all learners. So special education is still prioritised in most of the countries. We found there was insufficient data to determine the percentage of education budgets spent on the education of children with disabilities. Some countries indicate targeted interventions and outline budget allocations specific to special education programs. However, the data available hasn't been adequate to draw conclusions about financing of disability inclusion. Next slide. In the economic context of South Asia, it is recommended that countries with GDPs that are relatively low will need to hit the upper limits of recommended benchmarks from the Incheon strategy if they are to effectively accommodate children in disability inclusive education systems. Funding earmarked for disability inclusive education may not always be apparent in budgets and financial plans. Allocation for disability inclusive education is sometimes embedded in general education interventions, which is not problematic in and of itself. However, there does need to be a clear articulation of the investments that are being made to make the general education system more inclusive and more responsive to diverse learners. Next slide, please. So when we look at the data on children with disabilities, we find that there's a lack of comparable data in the region. And available data tends to be from censuses and national household surveys. And the data that we were able to look at was collected using different methodologies over different periods between 2010 and 2019. The findings from an analysis of that tells us that disability prevalence varies widely, ranging from 1.4% to 13% of the total population. On average, 5.1% of the total population and 7.4% among children aged 0 to 19 years are living with some form of disability in the region. And on the whole, this data would suggest that disability prevalence rates in the region fall below global estimates. We also found that countries that adopted the Washington Group questions reported considerably higher percentages that are closer to internationally referenced prevalence estimates. Now, whether this can be attributed to the use of the Washington Group questions is difficult to establish, because even within a country, national data and statistics are often inconsistent and have wide discrepancies, and that's largely due to the varied approaches that are used. Next slide, please. Overall, the available data on completion rates for children with disabilities points that they are lagging behind their peers without disabilities. For example, a wide gap was observed in Bangladesh, where only 6% of children with disabilities enrolled in school actually completed primary education, which was about 5 times lower than those without disabilities. Next slide, please. The challenge in birth registration of children with disabilities is often compounded by stigma and discrimination and the absence of a systematic identification system. Current practices in some countries are beginning to confront registration issues. For example, Nepal's Ministry of Women, Children and Social Welfare's Disability Implements and Identification Card Scheme. The ID system entitles a person to receive social security allowances and ensures access to specialised services. We have found, as we said, that the Washington Group of Questions is increasingly being used in population censuses, surveys, and education management information systems across the region. And disability data in EMIS in South Asia does need to be recognised that it's often limited, though, to enrolment data. However, current practices and future plans to improve EMIS are promising. So, for example, Bhutan and Pakistan already utilise adapted versions of the Washington Group questions, and Nepal is implementing a pilot project to integrate the Washington Group questions into EMIS. Maldives will strengthen their EMIS and will include tracking of the learning progress of children with disabilities. Next slide, please. So, leadership and management. We found that countries across the region have institutionalized tools for school leaders to engage in a process of reflection, planning, and action to achieve equitable education for all. Inclusive leadership is encouraged when school leaders are provided methods to assess their schools against inclusive and quality standards. 6 countries in the region have roles in disability inclusive education implementation embedded in the mandate of key departments and offices in the Ministry of Education. Vertical coordination mechanisms strengthen inclusive education implementation, and all countries in the region have a system for vertical coordination in place for special education. 5 were identified to have vertical coordination units specifically for strengthening inclusive education, and these were Afghanistan, Bangladesh, the Maldives, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. family, community engagement, and partnerships. So policies we found are facilitative of family and community engagement, but only some countries are able to translate these into working mechanisms of coordination. So Afghanistan's interministerial multi-sectoral task force on disability established the key roles of parents, caregivers, school community, organisations for persons with disabilities, and other formal and informal support organisations in inclusive education. And Bangladesh has established similar mechanisms. While enabling policies and systems are in place to develop and maintain partnerships with development organisations, OPDs and civil society organisations, a mechanism to harmonise initiatives of all partners towards inclusion is missing in most countries. Across the region, the civil society community supports and/or leads various initiatives in bringing more children with disabilities to school. And evidence suggests that many civil society organisations and OPDs across all countries also support programmes that promote segregated education provisions. So it's important that all education stakeholders are working towards the inclusion of children with disabilities in education, and that they share the same rights-based definition of disability and are on the same progressive path to inclusion. There are promising initiatives to include families, caregivers, and children with disabilities in decision-making processes at local levels, but there is limited evidence on national level policymaking and programming. At the school and community level, almost all countries in the region engage families and caregivers of children with disabilities in their education. But this participation varies in degree, from being recipients of information, as in Bhutan, to providing feedback on school effectiveness, such as during school self-assessment in Sri Lanka. Next slide, please. Awareness, attitudes, and practices. General provisions to raise awareness on disability and increase access to education of children with disabilities are apparent across the region, and UNICEF has been leading communication for change and development in this way. Studies on gaps, opportunities, and assessment of inclusive education initiatives and disability-related services were also undertaken in all countries in the region, and the knowledge gained from these studies provides vital perspectives on the barriers being experienced by children with disabilities. The results of the mapping survey showed that respondents believe that the lack of awareness of and negative attitudes to disability and inclusive education are the main challenges in family and community participation in disability inclusive education. And studies from India, Bangladesh, and Nepal showed that negative attitudes towards IE were linked to a lack of knowledge and training on disability and IE. Next slide, please. Approaches to educating children with disabilities. So we found that dual education systems are common across the region, where governments are providing general education and special education programs in the formal education system. In all 8 countries in South Asia, special education is the main provision for children with specific disabilities such as visual and hearing impairments. Alternative provisions for education children with disabilities in diverse contexts are made available by almost all countries in the region. For example, Nepal provides non-formal education options for children with disabilities equivalent to a formal education. Afghanistan was offering community-based education. Pakistan and India provide home-based education to reach children with disabilities who are not able to access school and learning centres due to issues in mobility. Youth with disabilities must have equitable access to all levels of education, whether through academic programmes or through TVET. And this requires governments to work towards transforming the secondary system so that all students can make equitable choices about their preferred pathway, rather than being encouraged into non-academic pathways because of a disability label. Next slide, please. Education, workforce development and teacher training. So across the region, we found that international aid agencies contribute to improving the capacity of governments, school leaders and teachers in adopting disability inclusive approaches to teaching and learning. All countries in the region have special education programs in universities and teacher training institutions focusing on teaching children with disabilities. Inclusive education is starting to be introduced in university programs, some more comprehensively than others. Various initiatives have been developed across the region to provide in-service support to teachers. And among these are national policies that contain imperatives to include skills development of teachers in teaching learners with disabilities, development of standards for teacher training institutions, development of decentralized methods for in-service teacher education, and efforts to embed disability inclusive indicators in teacher competency standards. Despite the training available for teachers, the findings show that in all the countries in the region, teachers still lack the confidence and skills needed to teach and respond to diverse learners. A common challenge seems to be the need for a coordinated and systemic response to in-service teacher development. Training must be aligned with disability inclusive competency frameworks. And we must make sure that the content is practical and responsive to teaching needs, that it espouses the values and principles of the CRPD, and that it supports teachers across different career stages. Next slide, please. School environment and infrastructure. One of the reasons children with disabilities do not attend school in the region appears to be the lack of classrooms with accessible infrastructure and a supportive school environment. And in many countries in South Asia, improvements in school facilities, furniture, and adopting inclusive design to school building construction for a safe, accessible, and disaster resilient school environment have been included in education sector plans. We know that countries in the South Asia region are prone to natural disasters, such as cyclones, landslides, earthquakes, and this results in the destruction of infrastructure, including schools and learning centres. All countries have developed minimum standards to foster safe schools, where recent developments have been focused on safety in the context of disaster and risk preparedness. Violence against children with and without disabilities, however, is prevalent in various education settings across South Asia. In general, boys seem to be more at risk of physical violence and corporal punishment than girls, while girls seem to be more likely to experience sexual and psychological abuse than boys. Although there's limited data on the prevalence of violence against children with disabilities in the region, the existing research does note that children with disabilities are more prone to experiencing all forms of violence. Next slide, please. Curriculum, pedagogy and assessment. So we found that in most countries, curriculum review and revision are identified as one of the major strategies to respond to the need for a diversified and inclusive curriculum in order to increase accessibility and participation of children with disabilities. Amongst the 8 countries, Maldives and Pakistan established the most recent national curriculum frameworks. And the Indian government is producing a new national curriculum framework following the release of its national educational policy in July 2020. Countries do appear to have taken actions to balance the use and implementation of formative and summative assessments, and to transition from conventional assessment to assessment for learning as a strategy to improve learning outcomes. And guidelines for differentiation and learner-centered approaches in curriculum, instruction and assessment are in place in the Maldives, India, Bhutan, and Pakistan. Learning materials. Next slide, please. Across the region, we found there's a general lack of accessible learning materials and devices for children with disabilities. In countries where they are made available, access remains limited, especially for those living in remote areas. And there's also an absence of flexible and adaptable teaching and learning materials, which is linked to the lack of teacher training on universal design principles as a foundation for developing teaching aids. Partnerships with NGOs and OPDs help to address these issues. In Bangladesh, for example, the Bangla Sign Language has been developed together with the Centre for Disability Development. Aside from textbooks, assistive devices for children with disabilities are found to be scarce in most countries. It's generally acknowledged that these assistive products used by children with disabilities in learning, such as Braille, sign language modules, dictionaries, and hearing aids, among others, are essential for ensuring equal opportunities in learning. And it's also recognised there is a wide gap in addressing concerns regarding the supply and demand for these. Next slide, please. Support services for students, parents, and teachers. We found that early identification and intervention programs across the region are delivered mainly through the support of and coordination with development partners, NGOs, OPDs, civil society organisations, and so on. Whilst there are many organisations supporting early childhood programs in the region, it's reported that only 69% of children are able to access early childhood education. Globally, one of the main factors that affects participation is household economic status. Children from higher income households are 7 times more likely to attend ECE programs than those from lower income households. However, we should say that data on the participation of children with disabilities in early childhood appears to be very limited. In all countries, community-based rehabilitation programs do help sustain access to essential services, such as early identification and intervention, referral to healthcare and social services, and so on. However, again, we would say that there is generally weak data on children with disabilities and the extent to which they are able to access the formal education system. Almost all the countries do provide some form of social protection support for children with disabilities and their families. Some countries provide multiple benefits. For example, Nepal provides 16 types of scholarships for children with disabilities and other vulnerable groups. Next slide, please. Measuring and monitoring quality. Most countries in the region have institutionalized standards for school quality and inclusion. For example, in Bangladesh, the primary school quality level includes inclusive education indicators. And the standards for inclusive education in Bhutan do encourage a collaborative and self-reflective process in school communities. And there is an emphasis on inclusion as a continuous process. Monitoring mechanisms for disability inclusive indicators and quality assurance of disability inclusive programs have been developed across the region, although the extent of the data gathered and their utilization varies amongst the countries. Involvement of organisation of persons with disabilities in monitoring is also variable, but there are some examples they are being included. For example, in Nepal, the National Association of Hard of Hearing participates in monitoring data on persons with disabilities. But we found overall that this was an area that does need development. Next slide. Gender and humanitarian issues.
Peter,
Yeah.
could I ask you to sort of wrap up in about 5 minutes?
We have just the key recommendations to go after this.
Okay, great.
Hopefully
Thank
that
you
will
so
be
much.
okay. So I will just rapidly cover this. So we see that there is legislation and education plans across the region supporting the education of girls with explicit provision on girls' access to education. And in some of those cases, there has been a focus on girls with disabilities. In response and recovery plans of almost all countries, children with disabilities and marginalised groups have been taken into account by government. And different approaches have been specifically targeted for children with disabilities. Countries have adopted and developed a contextualised interagency network for education in emergencies, minimum standards for education in response to the call of SDG 4, Target 4, on providing safe schools for children with disabilities as well. So just to finish, I will just rapidly go through the key recommendations. Next slide, please. And the next slide again, thanks. So we've broken these down into different areas. The first slide is on for governments. So these recommendations are to strengthen legislative frameworks and increase accountability, to increase investment in inclusive education and improve data on children with disabilities. Very importantly, to apply universal design in teaching and learning and also infrastructure. To strengthen institutional capacity for inclusive education implementation, and particularly to increase the focus on supporting teachers and raising teacher quality. Improving coordination and partnerships, and increasing opportunities for learning amongst and within countries. Developing awareness and understanding of disability and inclusion, and ensuring that learning continuity for children with disabilities is included in COVID-19 response and recovery plans. Also ensuring gender equality and making sure that we set achievable strategic goals which are evidence-based. Next slide is for civil society and development organisations to continue advocating for disability inclusive education, to provide direct programming and funding for this, to work towards strengthening institutional capacity to support sustainability, and to make sure that we are creating communities of practice where learning is developed and shared. And that's linked to the next slide. For further research, is that we need to really be looking in more detail at an analysis of financing and expenditure on disability inclusion, to build evidence of good practice and make sure that this is disseminated, and through research knowledge, tackle attitudes and practices towards disability. We feel there should be a mapping study on the accessibility of learning environments, and we need to look at in more detail the recruitment, training and impact of teachers with disabilities in disability inclusive education. So I will finish there. Thank you for that, and any questions we'd be happy to answer them. Back to you, Mita.
Thank you so much for that, Peter, for giving that very comprehensive overview of the report. And we actually are, there's some very good questions that have come in the Q&A function. In the interest of time, we'll be looking to answer those within the Q&A space. And so thank you all for your questions. And thank you again, Peter, for your presentation. I'm going to hand things back over to Christy for the next segment of the program. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mita. Thank you for sharing this very comprehensive report. I think the report will serve as a great regional resource to develop evidence-based policy for children with disabilities. I think this is a great introduction to the second part of the webinar. We will now move on to the panel discussion session. I would like to invite Mr. Tolhas Dominic, CEO of Wahana Inclusive Indonesia and a Disability Inclusion Advisor for the IFES ASEAN Project Indonesia, to moderate the panel session. Mr. Dominic has 16 years professional experience advocating for and providing technical advice for the promotion of the rights of persons with disabilities, particularly related to education, employment, political participation, human rights, and social protection. Mr. Dominic worked for several disability inclusive projects with several international organizations in Indonesia. In 2013, Mr. Dominic received the Inclusive Education Award from the Indonesian Ministry of National Education for his dedicated work on supporting the development of the inclusive education system in Indonesia. Over to you, Mr. Dominic.
Thank you very much, Christy, and good afternoon, good evening, and good morning for all of you, our distinguished participants of this webinar. So firstly, let me ask us to celebrate the International Day of Person with Disability, which will be tomorrow, but I think the all celebration has been started since a week ago, and very glad that and very a great honor for me to be able to participate in this event. So thank you for the committee. And we actually in this session we will have a further discussion on how to make sure that we will have the inclusive, sustainable, accessible school for our children with disability. And in this discussion session, we already invited four very distinguished speakers. First is Dr. Salma Ghaffar, from the head of the Special Education Department, the Ministry of Education, Malaysia. Second speaker will be Ms. Anjali Agarbepi from Samarkand, India, and the third speaker will be Ms. Prasanti Pradhan from, I'm sure that she will speak on behalf of the parents group from Bhutan. And the fourth speaker will be Ms. Ika Putri Mahardika, the Inclusive Education Program Officer from Wahana Inclusive Indonesia. So without further ado, I think I would like to welcome Dr. Salma Ghaffar from Malaysia to do her presentation. And each speaker will have approximately 8 minutes to do their presentation. But actually, it's not a presentation, but rather to answer the question. Let me start with the question for Dr. Salma, because actually here she's representing the government. So the question to her would be, what's the initial the initiative already come from the government to ensure the inclusive education has been taken place, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, and what will be some of the challenges and how the government can overcome those kind of challenges that still exist. Even when we heard the presentation from the previous speakers, we have heard so many challenges, but also opportunities to make sure that disability inclusive can be also done in school or education. So without further ado, I would like to offer and give time to Dr. Salma to do the presentation. Dr. Salma, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Talharas. Happy to see you again. Because we first met somewhere in 2017, I think.
Yes.
In Danang.
Yeah.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Very good afternoon, good evening, and good morning, fellow panelists. Well, before I start, I would like to highlight again, in Malaysia, under the Ministry of Education, we have 6 categories of special educational need children, that is physical, visual disability, hearing disability, speech disability, physical disability, and then learning disabilities, and also multiple disabilities or difficulties. And where do they go? to school. Where do they get their education? They can go either they can opt for special education schools or special education integrated program or inclusive education program. And what kind of curriculum that they may follow? Okay, it's either national curriculum or national curriculum which is modified by the Registrar General, or any skills, or any skills training curriculum which, in the opinion of the Registrar General, is suitable and beneficial for the student with special education needs. Okay, and well, during pandemic, okay, everybody is affected during pandemic. What more our special educational need children? So how do they access to education during pandemic? So in Malaysia, they may access to education through home-based learning, according to suitability of the student during pandemic. So the implementation of the home-based learning for students with SEN includes curriculum alignment, annual lesson plan, and then daily lesson plan and individual education plan. And then we have classroom assessment and also support. We do have support services. Okay, now the first one, as I mentioned earlier, through curriculum alignment, where we have a task force and it was established in school level to ensure the existing curriculum was aligned with the post-pandemic school session. And then the annual lesson plan, given that annual lesson plan was also affected during the pandemic, so school were equipped with the relevant strategies to identify core content, additional content, and also complementary content of each subject when redesigning their annual lesson plan. And we do have also a daily lesson plan and individual education plan, in which among the strategies employed by our teachers were in planning appropriate daily lesson plan activity based on the new annual lesson plan, and also taking into consideration of the ability and capability of our SEN students during home-based learning. And also, as usual, as everyone knows, that students with SEN also provided with intervention activities and also support through IEP, where the teachers took into account their personal development, physical age, and also mental age. So this plan could be done through offline or online. And then apart from that, apart from the various teaching and learning strategies adopted by our teachers, students with SEN also assessed by their teachers via classroom assessment approaches, such as using a variety of simple and easy methods and instruments to record the progress and level of the student. And also the assessment can also be carried out in collaboration with the parents or guardians through instrument and guideline provided by the teacher. And in Malaysia, we do have support services in which we have 13 special education service centers throughout Malaysia, and which provide support services to students with SEN, such as screening, intervention, and also consultation. And after that, we also come up with our catch-up plan for students with SEN. So the main goal of this catch-up plan is to assist in strengthening basic literacy and numeracy among students with SEN, as well as to help improving their mastery in other subjects. So this catch-up plan serves 3 key objectives. Is it possible for you to, yeah, thank you so much. This is the diagram. Okay, the catch-up plan serves 3 key objectives. That is including improving students' mastery of the current year's curriculum content, and then bridging the student learning gap that exists during pandemic, and providing curriculum support materials to teachers to help them implement teaching and learning more effectively. So indirectly, this plan can help to ensure our students are equipped substantially and ready to follow the curriculum of the 2022 school year. So empowerment of curriculum implementation focuses on the implementation strategy of enrichment programs and also intervention for students with SEN readiness to strengthen their basic literacy and numeracy skills. So during the period from 20th January to 31st August 2021, so the implementation of the curriculum should be reached at least 70% of the curriculum. That is the target line should be reached 70% and through home-based learning. So, and then as you know, from the 3rd October 2021, students we send in special education school, in special education integrated program, they return to school. They come back to school without rotation, meaning to say 100% send students come back to school to get their education face-to-face. So this was what deemed necessary to ensure that students with SEND could undergo teaching and learning more effectively via face-to-face session with their teachers. And the implementation of curriculum core contents were done within the first 2 weeks, and the student achievement were recorded, and then the implementation of the core content that below 70 had to be enhanced using among the 5 proposed approaches such as thematic approach, modular approach, project-based learning, differentiated learning, and also virtual lab. So the implementation of curriculum core content that has achieved more than 70% who follow with the usual teaching and learning. So for students with SEND who have difficulty in passing the assessment, they will be provided with intervention programs too. So whereas for those who pass, enrichment program will be given. So this implementation of the catch-up plan to January 2nd to February 28, 2022, so we'll be focusing on the learning of the 2021 curriculum. So the intervention and the arrangement of program will be implemented during this term session. So this is how we do during the pandemic and after they come back to school face to face. Okay, with that, I would like to say thank you.
Okay, Dr. Salma, since we still have the a minute for your presentation, what will be the challenges that now you're facing in Malaysia in terms of establishing inclusive education?
In establishing inclusive education, as I mentioned earlier just now, we have 3 as we said, in establishing inclusive education. Okay, actually in Malaysia we have 3 types of schooling. That is the first one, special education school, and then integrated program, also inclusive program. The challenges, actually, the challenges is how. What are the challenges, by the way? Actually, we have so many challenges, and some of the challenges, as we mentioned, through our our speakers before, because if let's say through if let's say the learning and teaching process through online, it is a bit difficult, because if it is inclusive education, we need to say the children, our SEND children, they study together with the mainstream children. So, but then at the same time, how do we come about to it? How do we go, come over? How do we go over about it? With the help of our teachers, with the help of our special ed teachers, through some activities like intervention and everything. And also in promoting inclusive education in our countries, we need to do lots of awareness activities, because in terms of acceptance, I think most countries that they are facing the same thing. And also the teachers' competencies, because okay, when we implement, when we promote our inclusive education program, so our children, our special ed children, the subject matter expert teachers, they are not special education teachers, right? They are not special education background teachers. So when it comes to teachers' competency in attending to the need of the student with SEND, we do have some challenges. So how do you overcome? we do give them training. We do give them training in terms of how to attend to the needs of our children. These are some challenges faced by our children in inclusive education program. For your information, there are different countries. The interpretation of inclusive program may be different because in our country, because I see some of the countries, if let's say the children go to the mainstream schools, even though they are among themselves, they are among a 10 students in one classroom, considered as inclusive program. But in our country, we address that as special integrated program, special education integrated program. And the definition of our IEP, inclusive education program, is where our children will study together with the mainstream children in the mainstream classroom. But still, okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Salma. I think we can continue the discussion later during the Q&A session. So thank you very much for the comprehensive information from you about how the children with disability pursue their education in Malaysia, and you already explained some of the key challenges. I think more or less in countries in the world are facing the same challenges when they need to go through the home-based learning program.
Yeah, that's right.
So thank you very much, Dr. Salma. We'll be back to you later.
Okay, thank you.
So our next speaker will be Miss Anjali Agarbe. She's the founder and executive director of Samarkand, India. She's the one who found the Samarkand National Center of Accessible Environment in 1993, and also she's a CSO member of CSO standing committee on Niti Aayog, Government of India, the CSO responsible for the implementation of the SDG, the Sustainable Development Goal. And Mrs. Anjali also the researcher, an expert in author, and also expert in accessibility, mobility, and inclusive accessibility and mobility. So Miss Anjali, you will ask the question about why it is important to have to implement inclusive education, and how you expect all stakeholders collaborate or work together to implement the success of inclusive education. Miss Anjali, time is yours now.
Thank you so much, Tolas, and greetings from India. On the eve of the International Day for Persons with Disability, I'm extremely delighted and honored to be part of this discussion. I have a presentation. I'll share this presentation and also try to answer the question that you have raised right now. What is more important is that we need to have our children with disabilities included. They need to be counted, and they need to be part of the mainstream inclusive education instead of being into the special schools. So what is more important is also to understand that how the disability inclusive education can be made more accessible and sustainable the post-COVID world. And what I'm actually going to highlight is some of the achievements, or you can say initiatives, that my organization Samarkand has taken up in the past 28 years, where we actually focused on making the world universally accessible and inclusive. Our initiative has been divided into 5 focus points. One is the demand for inclusive education, and then the service delivery, how we can bring about the change of inclusion by looking at the infrastructure, information, communication, teaching, learning methodologies, and also the inclusion of children with disabilities with the non-disabled children and the environment. So the focus was also on enabling environment, how we can actually make it possible for children with and without disabilities to work together, to grow together, to play together and learn together. Lot of advocacy has gone with the government departments and service providers and decision making to see that we can have children with disabilities included into mainstream schooling and processes of learning and teaching. And for that, we also have developed measuring and monitoring quality tools through scorecard processes with the communities and with the parents of children with disabilities. What we have done is to do the infrastructure gap analysis of the schools, and we have done more than 640 schools in 16 cities and semi-urban areas in the last 5 years. But we have also taken up more than 30,000 schools and Anganwadi centers where the early intervention rehabilitation processes of children occurs, to see that the home-based education of the children can also be undertaken and children can be prepared from the home, and then they can have a transitional phase to be mainstreamed education in the inclusive settings. We have also authored the accessibility code for educational institutions. This is very recent in 2021 June, and this is for the Ministry of Education, Government of India, so that we have national accessibility standards for educational institutions, and schools are the core lines for that. We have authored the Global Monitoring Report on Education Schools Accessibility for Children with Disability with UNESCO in 2019, and there we have found a lot of gaps and the gray areas that why children with disabilities are not able to go to schools, and especially the girls with disabilities are left out of the entire gamut of education. It was actually not because that the children are not able to come to the schools, but also the infrastructure inaccessibility. I'm highlighting a couple of photographs that access to infrastructure, basic drinking water facilities, or climbing the steps because there are no handrails. Even the kind of discrimination that girls with disability face within the classroom, that they are made to sit at the back benches, and if there are girls with speech and hearing impairment, they are not able to do lip reading, or if the girls are with low vision, they're not able to see the green board or the blackboard. So the inequality and discrimination is quite starkly evident in the classrooms and the schools. There's also this lack of access features to the washrooms. So the girls' washrooms are the usually ones which are ignored completely. There are no ramps, no latches, there are no lights, and even no running water. And hence the girls with disabilities, especially when they are attaining puberty, they drop out since they can't go to the washrooms in the schools. We have two very important and very powerful acts in the country. One is the Right to Education Act 2009 that talks about children having equal rights and opportunities to access educational services. And we do also have a very recent national education policy that reiterates the need for barrier-free access to children with special needs for providing equitable educational opportunities. In spite of that, we are seeing that there is a lack of implementation, and hence there's the requirement of connectivity and networking with organization of persons with disability like ours, where we have seen that the South Asian perspective, its rights and evidence-based. Hence, what we are doing is we are reaffirming the collective commitment to build inclusive, accessible and sustainable post-COVID-19 world for children with disabilities and all of the society. The need is to create a fair and inclusive distribution of services and power. The power in terms of not the power of decision making, but also the patriarchal society that we have been actually experiencing for a couple of years in our country. And because of that, the gender parity is at stake. So all these things need to be tackled even during and post COVID-19 pandemic. The coordination and partnership has helped in many greater ways by actually understanding what is the shadow pandemic effect on education. We have seen the sizable number of children with disabilities who are unable to access quality education. It's all over the world. in India, there are a lot of children with disabilities who are under poverty line. And what has happened is they don't have access to gadgets like smartphones and laptops so that they can access virtual education. We are also demanding that when you are doing this Build Back Better, we want it to be inclusive so that when we do the accessibility audits of the educational institutions and when the funds are being provided by the government, we see that the educational institutions are made with child-friendly and disabled-friendly designs. So there's a lot of awareness and sensitization required to address the attitudinal, physical, communication, and institutional barriers. And we also need to have a twin track approach to see that disability-specific actions can happen with the universal design learning approaches, with a combination of user perspective, which is nothing about us without us, and also to see that no one is left behind, to ensure that no one is left behind. So our interventions have involved a combination of capacity building for the organization of persons with disabilities, combined with local government partnership and networking with the communities, identifying the gaps to service delivery and developing joint solutions for inclusive educations. And we have seen some outcomes in terms of space for ongoing advocacy is there, networking created and expanded, and the impact have started coming in terms of getting the policy implementation at national level is being improved. And there is a local accountability mechanism established where the OPDs connect with the children with disabilities parents, get information, connect with the headmasters and teachers in the schools, and then goes to the government education department. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and I'm open to any questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Ms. Anjali. One question to you: what will be the plan for the countries for the implementing the inclusive education post COVID-19?
We are planning in a big way in our country to ensure that the home-based education of the children with disabilities who are with severe and multiple disabilities, that education can continue in the homes. And once the children are prepared, they should be transferred to the mainstream education institutions. And the second is to provide inclusive physical infrastructure accessibility within the schools so that the children with less severe disabilities or mild and profound disabilities can continue. There's also this complete focus to do teachers training in a big way, where the special educators and teachers, the general teachers in the schools are being trained on how to teach children with disabilities. Because this is one thing which we have found is extremely lagged behind. And what Dr. Peters' report also was giving the evidence is that in spite of giving the basic teachers training on disability inclusive education, they are confused and they are little hesitant to teach children with disabilities. Hence, the children with disabilities drop out and remain out of school. So we are focusing on these particular aspects. Thank you for your question.
Thank you very much, Ms. Angela. We'll be back to you later for the Q question and answer. Okay, so our next speaker will be Ms. Prasanti Pradhan. She's the chairperson of the Pansan Parents Support Group from Bhutan. And I'm sure that she's speaking on behalf of parents of children with disabilities. And yes, Ms. Prasanti will answer the question about the role of the parents to ensure that children with disability can get their rights to education, and how parents should collaborate with the school, with teachers and other stakeholders to ensure that sustainable, accessible and inclusive learning can be achieved even post COVID-19. Ms. Prasanti, I welcome you to the stage and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Kuzuzangpola, that means greetings in my language. And it's a great honor for me to be here today on this wonderful event I'm not a scholar, and my educational background is not special education. It's not even education. I'm just a mother. I'm a mother on a mission who has taken it upon herself to advocate for a child's rights, to make sure that he is not left behind. My name is Prashanti, and today I'm here to tell you my story and the story of PenSim, Bhutan's first parent support group. To briefly introduce myself, I'm a mother of two children. My older one, 15-year-old girl, she's typically developing, and my 11-year-old son, Siddharth, due to whose entry into my life, everything changed. He was diagnosed with cerebral palsy combined with visual impairment at the age of 2.5 years old. And that was when I decided to give up my career in the civil service and focus on improving the quality of my son's life. And somewhere along the way, my paths crossed with two other mothers, Chimi and Karma, who had the same story as I. And we instantly connected and we bonded and derived so much support and comfort from each other. And we wanted to extend this support to other families, other parents who were struggling. And thus the concept of PenSim was born. And we were hugely inspired by PAVIC, which is a parent advocate group in the Philippines. And we realized that if we came together, we could really make a difference in the lives of our children. And that is how PenSim was initiated. PenSim is a combination of two words in our language, in Dzongkha. It means positive attitude. So we started on a combination and alliance of positive attitude and hope of parents to bring about actions that are useful and will benefit the children and the parents and ultimately the society as a whole. So this is our vision. You can see that we talk about empowering parents. And a lot of times I get asked, why another CSO? And to tell you, in Bhutan, currently we have 5 OPDs who are registered CSOs, but all these other OPDs work to, the focus is on the person or the child with the disability. Whereas in PenSim, we strongly believe that if you want the child or the person with the disability to thrive, then the environment has to be healthy first. The caregivers need to be looked after. And so this is what we do. And another thing is that it is, we have a lot of experts who have studied the subject, but we parents, we live the life and we know the issues. And and what is very unique about PenSim is that it is run purely by parents. And our board of trustees comprises fully of parents. And our tagline is also of the parents, by the parents, for life. And I also want to tell you that, everybody around is considered experts, and we have a lot of parents here who are told what to do for their children, and many of them don't even have the confidence to voice their opinions. We want to change that. We want to make the parents of children with disabilities in Bhutan feel empowered and confident so that they can be part of the decision-making process in improving the quality of the lives of their children. And we also want the parents to build up a strong network and support system amongst each other. So we started with 6 parents when we started informally in 2017. And as of July 30th, 2020, PenSim was registered as a CSO in Bhutan. And we are Bhutan's first registered recognized parent support group. And right now we have over 100 members who are all parents of children with disabilities. And we have another 100 or so members who really don't have anybody with disabilities in the family, but they support us, and we call them Friends of PenSim. And just to show you, these are all just pictures of us getting together, the peer support happening, counseling happening. And we are very inspired by His Majesty's words, which were spoken on 2014. And we strongly believe that education is the equalizer. And we realized that it was very important for our children to get access to education in the very primary level. And there is a lot of talk about vocational trainings and employment, but if we want that to happen, first the children have to get into the education system at a very basic level. And it is very sad, but it is unfortunately a sad truth that children with disabilities do not get accepted in a lot of ECCD centers and schools, and not for any other reason, but the management, they think that the investments will be huge, and they're not confident that they'll be able to do justice to these children. And we wanted to see if this was really true, and we did a small pilot project in Thimphu with support from Helvetas, and on a very small scale. We selected 2 private schools, and we enrolled children with all kinds of disabilities, and these were like very severe disabilities ranging from cerebral palsy to autism to learning difficulties. And we worked with these schools for 2 years, and we're very happy to say that it was a huge success. And why it was a huge success was we didn't focus on training just 1 or 2 chosen identified teachers in the classrooms, but we trained the entire faculty, starting from the caregiver to the physical ed teacher to the language teacher to the homeroom teachers, everybody. And it wasn't like very fancy training. It was just very intensive 1-week workshop where they were taught the basics of how to adapt and modify their lessons and how to deal with children with disabilities. And besides that, we also employed aides, and they were young ladies who had graduated high school, and they also participated in this training, and they were placed in the classrooms to bridge the gap between the teacher and the child or the children with the disability. And we also made sure that the parents were strongly involved. It was not just about bringing a child and handing them over to the school to take care of, but we made sure that the teachers and the parents sat together along with the aides and discussed their child's goals and progress, and it went very well. And these are some pictures of our children. In some cases, you can't even make out which is the child with the disability. And the school made some very small contributions in terms of making the space accessible, like putting a small ramp and making sure that the classrooms for physically challenged children were on the ground floor instead of on the higher floors, and a little, supportive toilet and changing room, those kind of things. And besides studies, we also trained the teachers to include the children in play. We are very proud of this training that we did for our partner schools, because all the teachers, they said in their entire career they had never participated in a training where they were taught how to play with children with disabilities, and not just segregate them, but make them include the entire classroom in the play. So, and just to tell you that I wanted to share that with you. Now, to come to the issues right now, we have been talking about post-COVID and how it has affected education, and I want to give you a very different perspective over here. When in 2020 the world was suddenly like what do you say? The world was suddenly introduced to this very new concept of lockdowns and things like that. I must tell you that for us, it really wasn't. It wasn't a huge change. We were still at home. We were still having difficulties taking our children out, and in a small way, we also kind of hoped that this particular situation that we parents of children with disabilities, we face every day, we hope the rest of the parents who have typically developing children, you got to experience it a bit and experience some empathy. And it was like COVID, the situation, it wasn't such a big change for us, so to speak. And now I will come back to accessing education, which is an issue. I speak on behalf of all the parents in my country. We have so many barriers, and for us as a country in the mountains, physical barriers is the first thing. We talk about accessibility, physical accessibility. We have these uneven pathways, narrow door frames, steps everywhere, and don't even get me started on the toilets. But while physical accessibility is what comes to everybody's mind first, there are accessibility issues for persons and children who are physically fine, but they have hidden disabilities. There are children who cannot handle regimented routines, children who cannot sit quietly in one place for, let's say, 45 minutes, children who cannot stand still during assembly, who need to be constantly moving, and they cannot learn the conventional way of reading and writing. All these children can learn, every child can learn, but it's just that they learn differently. And I think we need to accept and understand that. And then we come to financial difficulties. Raising a child with a disability is a very expensive affair. Diapers, supportive equipment, special equipment, and in our case, it is also, if we want our child to go to school, we need to either hire somebody to stay with the child, or one of the parents has to sacrifice their income so that they can sit with their child in school. And in so many of our cases, children are deprived of education because parents cannot afford so many of these options. And
sorry, Ms. Prasanti, yeah, your time is up. Maybe you can have like a minute to finish your presentation. Thank you.
I will just say that I think we need to change, and I really liked Mr. Neil Shrestha's remark about saying that inclusive education, people think it's expensive, but exclusive education is going to prove to be even more expensive in the long run. And I think we really need to move out of the special education system and move into the inclusive education system, which is still not happening in Bhutan. So I will close with this, and I will say that I repeat His Majesty's words again, which says that all parents have the same hopes and dreams for their children, and we want our children, irrespective of their abilities, to be able to stand as equal amongst each other, and we want our children to be respected as a human being and not just as an object of sympathy. I'm sorry I took up so much of time, but I just go on and on when given the opportunity.
No problem, Ms. Prasanti. Thank you very much for your presentation. I think you already gave us ideas about how the role of the parents to ensure that the right of children with disability has to be protected or fulfilled in terms of in the field of education. And also thank you for your and encouraging messages telling us that inclusive education is something that we need to implement to reduce the cost, because even in other there are a lot of questions about whether inclusive education is the best solution for fulfilling the right of person with disability to education. There are a lot of opinion about that, and I'm sure that your presentation actually also give us some insight why we think that inclusive education is the best solution for that. Thank you very much, Ms. Prasanti, and we'll be back to you for the Q&A. And our last speaker will be Ms. Ika Putri Mahardika. She's the Inclusive Education Program Officer and also the social media specialist for Wahana Inclusive Indonesia. And Ms. Ika Putri Mahardika will answer the question about the role, the initiative that come from the Organization of Persons with Disabilities to ensure the inclusivity, accessibility, and sustainability of the inclusive education. Ms. Ika Putri Mahardika, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tolhas Damanik, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me share the presentation that I will show to everyone. Okay, as mentioned before by Mr. Tolhas, we would like to show you the key initiatives in promoting inclusive education during and post-COVID-19 from our perspective as the organization of persons with disabilities. But first of all, let me introduce to you all who is Wahana Inclusive Indonesia. So Wahana Inclusive Indonesia is the organization that established in 2013 in Depok, West Java, which focus on enhancing the quality of education for children with disabilities through the implementation of inclusive education based on the belief that all children have a right to education. Inclusive education is an approach to increase access to education for all children, regardless of their disability. And here we also have some programs that laying down from advocacy, capacity building, technical support to inclusive schools, counseling for parents, awareness raising, and also research and development on disabilities and inclusive education issues. And now we would like to show you how is the inclusive education situation in Indonesia. As per January 2021, the data from Ministry of Education, Research and Technology shows that more than 30,000 schools have been implementing the inclusive education system. There are more than 103,000 students with special needs who studying in the regular schools. However, the National Statistical Bureau in 2018 revealed that approximately 30% of persons with disabilities are not or not yet attending schools, and more than 70% of persons with disabilities drop out of schools. And then we are facing the COVID-19 pandemic. There are so many challenges over this pandemic situation, and we figure out the four main challenges over the COVID-19 pandemic. The first challenges that we are facing is the large-scale social restriction, as the implementation of the social restriction limits human interaction, and it prohibits any activities that gather large number of people. Several activities are transformed from the conventional to online activities, including school learning. And the second one is inequalities. During the pandemic, there are a lot of complaints from parents of students with disabilities that they weren't really engaged in the online learning process because the teachers and schools are still adapting to the pandemic situation. And then we have problems of online learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only students who have difficulty to adapt with the online learning, but teachers and parents also have difficulty to adapt with the online learning process. Technological literacy, additional internet fee, miscommunication, and unclear learning hours are the main problem of this online learning process. And last but not least, is the needs for educational support. Before the pandemic, all of the support already provided in schools. But when students with disabilities need to learn from home, some of the supports were missing because they don't have the media or tools they have at home. So due to these challenges, we are doing some initiatives as an OPDs for supporting the inclusive education implementations, the first thing that we are doing is study of support for students with disabilities during the COVID-19 pandemic. It was conducted by Wahan Inclusive Indonesia through the support from UNICEF Indonesia and also Ministry of Education, Research and Technology. The second one, we are having webinar series on the development of implementation of inclusive education during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. And the third one, and that still ongoing, is program Sekolah Ramah Berbudaya Inklusif, or Making School Friendly and Inclusive. Both were conducted by Wahana Inclusive Indonesia through the support from Ministry of Education, Research and Technology. And now we are focused on the second and the third initiatives that were webinar series on the development of implementation inclusive education during the post-COVID-19 pandemic. Through this webinar, we are having intentions to create the venue for consultation among all stakeholders and to discuss how to achieve sustainable inclusive education during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. That is why in this webinar, we were able to invite some of the key actors as the speakers. There are Ministry of Education, Research and Technology, District Department of Education, District Office of Planning and Budgeting Bureau, teachers, principals, and also parents. And some of the recommendations we get from the webinar was, the first thing we need to do is building a comprehensive mapping of social, demographic, economic, and also geographic related data on students with disabilities. The second one is capacity building for teachers and parents, especially in the digital literacy aspect through various trainings. And the third one is preparing various health protocol facilities to enter the post-pandemic period, especially in schools. And from the program Making School Friendly and Inclusive, or we call it Sekolah Ramah Berbudaya Inklusif in Indonesia, we are trying to strengthen the capacity of the teachers and schools in implementing inclusive education during and post-COVID-19 pandemic. We were targeting 20 primary schools, 300 teachers, 20 schools principals, and also 10 school supervisors from Depok area, West Java. And some of the main activities we are doing in this program are training on inclusive education for teachers, school principals, also school supervisors, technical support to schools, and having awareness raising campaign through the radio, also doing monitoring to the schools that we are assisting. So, ladies and gentlemen, with the key initiatives that we have here, we are expecting the implementation of inclusive education in schools could be better, both during and also post-COVID-19 pandemic. And now I give back the time to Mr. Tolhas Damanik. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes.
And Mr.
Thank you,
Tolhas.
Ms. Ika Putri. One last question. You can answer in 1 minute. Why it is important to foster the leadership and participation of persons with disability in terms of inclusive education? What will be your recommendation to foster the collaboration among all stakeholders?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Tolhas. So, based on our experience as the OPD, we saw the leadership and also participation from the persons with disabilities are really important because three things. The first thing, as we all know, the jargon for the disability movement is nothing about us without us. So it is important to have leadership and participation from persons with disabilities because they are the one who really understand the challenges, their needs, and the alternative solutions for overcoming those challenges. The second one is person with disabilities is the key actor for making the world more inclusive. So they can encourage people to also involve in the effort for changing. And the third one is it is also proven to the society that persons with disability have the strong capacity to initiate the changes in the society. That is why it is important to foster the leadership and participation of persons with disabilities. And you also mentioned that what can we do as the OPD, or how can we build a greater coordination among the actors of persons with disabilities to create more leadership and participation from persons with disabilities. So if you can see from the initiatives that we have done so far, we have 3 recommendations for encouraging greater coordination. The first is advancing the dialogue and consultation between the government and OPDs or CSOs and also other key actors. And the second one is having a collaborative action between OPDs and other actors so that it will initiate movement in the society. And then the third one is also raising awareness towards intersectionality issues of persons with disabilities, because as we can see, maybe we realize it or not, if we are talking about human rights, then it is also included the persons with disabilities rights. If we are talking about women's rights, it is also included the rights of women with disabilities. But so far, people like missing that out. We were still working on particular issues instead of trying to build awareness about the intersectionality issues that we already have this whole time. Maybe that's all that I can share to you about the
Thank you very much.
process of leadership, Mr. Tolhas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ika Putri Mahardika. Okay, I don't think we have time to entertain the Q&A. I know that the time is very limited, and we need to end this webinar by 3. So thank you very much for your participation. If you have any question, I think the speaker will be happy to answer the question through the Q&A facility of this webinar. So again, I think all of the ideas broadened by the speakers already inform us why it is important for us just to foster the leadership and participation, not only person with disability, but all stakeholders, to ensure that the inclusive education can be implemented successfully. We know we are facing so many challenges, especially since we are now facing the COVID-19 pandemic, and we are not sure when the situation will be back to normal. But with the big hope, with the celebration of the International Day of Person with Disability in 2021, we really have the strong or big expectation that the right of person with disability, the right of children with disability in education shall be fulfilled and protected through our collaborative efforts. So thank you very much for your attention to this discussion. Thank you very much for all speakers, and I will hand over this. I will hand over the floor to Christy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Dominic, for your moderation for the rich panel discussion. As Mr. Dominic mentioned, we will collect all your questions and then post it on our webpage with all the responses later on. And also, if you haven't shared your events and comments, please don't forget to put it on the chat box or Q&A box so that we can collect and then post it later on as well. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Jim Akers, Regional Education Advisor at UNICEF Rosa, for his closing remarks. Mr. Akers is a co-chair of Learning and Education 2030 Plus Networking Group with UNICEF East Asia and the Pacific, and UNESCO Bangkok leading regional SDG 4 agenda. Prior to the current post, he was heading a training and education program at UNESCO IIEP and has worked for 13 years serving as a regional education advisor and disability focal point at UNICEF Eastern and Southern Africa and East Asia and the Pacific. Jim, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christy. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Everyone can hear me. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm occasionally having problems with internet connection here, so let's hope I can get my message across before I. But many thanks everybody for joining us at this very important meeting today on making schools more inclusive for children with disabilities. It's a auspicious time given that it's the day before the International
Christy, I think he's having the internet connection problem.
Yeah. Should we go with you first then? What should we do?
Okay, he's coming back.
Yes.
He's back.
Jim, are you there?
I'm back again. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Did you hear me start off before, Christy, or did you hear nothing?
We heard like first sentence and then it got cut.
Okay. Yeah, I've got some connectivity problems. I'm in the hills in Portugal.
Oh, wow.
In the mountains in Nepal, there's no problems, but in the hills in Europe, it's not as well connected, which is nice to hear. Development is uneven.
Yes.
Anyway, I was just saying, first of all, thank you very much for joining. It's the International Day of People with
Jim, we lost you again. In this case, can I ask Mita to give a short closing?
Right, sure. Or did you want to someone, or did you want me to? Oh, I think Jim's back.
I'm back again. Let me go straight to the messages, and then maybe people can fill back on the other things. I think from what we've heard, there are many challenges ahead, not least, but progress is being made at national levels and also on the ground at the subnational level. And I think one of the key challenges going forward, connect. Oh dear.
We lost you again, Jim. Okay, I think the connection is not stable for Jim. Mita, maybe you can say a few sentences, yeah, on
All
behalf
right.
of.
Yes, okay, so I'll just be very brief. I mean, I think just to follow on from what Jim was saying, that I think we've heard that there are, a number of challenges in place, but at the same time, we're seeing that progress is being made. And as we've heard from the experiences from our panelists and their work, as well as, I think we have Jim back, and also, through the mapping study results that really mapped some of these good practices. I think some of the issues that, we were hearing from some of our speakers, really pointed to, the fact that I think there's been progress made in terms of policies and that are in place promoting inclusive education, but we are still seeing that divide in terms of having both kind of inclusive education, programs at the same time as, special education still sort of continuing. And I think from what our panelists were saying and some of the questions that were coming in, there was a lot of emphasis on the need for teacher education to be strengthened, and also teachers to gain that confidence in terms of promoting disability inclusive education more fully. And I think one of the issues we also heard about was about some of the intersections between issues of children with disabilities with other sort of factors, including the gender issues, poverty, and other factors that also, and now that we're seeing with the context of COVID, the digital divide as well, that we really need to take into account as we're looking at this overall issue. I'm not sure if I just wanted to pause and see if Jim wanted to step back in real quickly, because I do see your back, Jim. Just to give you the opportunity, otherwise I can continue. Okay, so I think Jim has said that there were the issues with the connection. Yeah, so I mean, I think we've also seen through the interventions of our colleagues that there is a need for greater coordination as well. We've heard about the different roles that are so critical to play, with the government, as well as organizations of persons with disabilities. But at the same time, as Prashanti also spoke so eloquently about, parents have a critical role to play, as do young people with disabilities. So that coordination is another area that really needs to be looked at and strengthened, to move this agenda forward. So these are some of the points that I think that were coming out of what we heard today. And really kind of looking at these issues as we look to build back better in this post-COVID context. I don't want to take up too much more time because I think we're reaching the end of our time, but maybe to hand over to Sawang if you had a few more points that you wanted to add. Thanks so much to everyone for joining today.
Okay, thanks, Mita. So we have now come to the end of the webinar on making school more inclusive, accessible, and sustainable for learners with disabilities post-COVID-19. And I hope that you all have enjoyed and learned useful knowledge and experience from it. But before we leave, please do not forget to complete the exit survey to help us improve our next activities. And this is our last webinar for this year, but of course we will come back again. So please stay tuned for a series of programs and events for next year, and we'll keep you posted. One last piece of news, on the 9th of December at 6 p.m. Bangkok time, there will be another webinar on the right to quality education for learners with disabilities, what makes a learning environment inclusive by UNESCO. So if you are interested, make sure to register. And on behalf of the Secretariat of the Disability Inclusive Education in Asia Pacific Working Group, I would like to thank everyone, the co-chairs, UNESCO, UNICEF, our speakers, panelists, moderators, participants, the ISL and live captioning teams for making this webinar a reality and a meaningful and fruitful one. So we hope that you will continue to support us. See you all again next year and have a great day. Goodbye.
Thank you, Sawang, and thank you, everyone. As Jim mentioned, let's stay connected in our efforts
Sure.
for disability going forward. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
very much,
everyone.
everyone. Bye-bye.